One of the decided advantages of having such a long professional career and such a long and productive life is that you've had the chance to meet a lot of people. And because you're in the Lutheran faith, we can make the assumption that you've met a lot of good people. But the first question is, who in the Lutheran faith are the leaders, the theologians who you met, you found the most inspirational, the most influential?
Well, one could go on listing quite a number of people there. Let me start by listing several that I had some experience with. For example, you heard the name frequently, I'm sure, the name of Joe Sittler. Joe Sittler was one of the outstanding, perhaps the outstanding theologian in the Lutheran Church in the generation just before me. But he was still going strong in my generation. And I've had some experiences which we may be able to share later in one of the sessions. But Joe Sittler was a strong theologian. He had a sense of the congregation and knew what congregational people might be interested in, might understand, and said it that way. In fact, I was with him on one occasion speaking to administrators of the Lutheran old folks' homes and the Lutheran service centers. And we had a whole week together. And each of us only had 2 speeches to give. And we had prepared those before we came. So we had time to spend in the hills of Montana at this conference. And I have to think of that week as one of the finest weeks in my life. Because I had an opportunity to raise questions of Joe Sittler, nonetheless. And he was a strong theologian and a true Lutheran theologian. He knew the congregation, he knew the synod structure, he knew the structure of the whole church and all of that. So he was one of the strong theologians. Another one was a young fellow. And I say a young fellow because, as I'll say in a few minutes, he attributes something to me, which is interesting, nevertheless. Anyway, the other one is William Lazarus. I first met Bill when Joe and the others, my wife and the others, came over on that ship. He was coming over to be in this work camp. And he stayed there for a while and went back at the end of the summer with the other work campers. And then one time I had occasion to fly back to the United States to meet with the committee in the United States. And we still needed people. And I called Bill. And I had to call him at the School for Attorneys at Hartman. That's where he was preparing for his life's work. Well, I called him, and he said, well, I don't know if I can come, but I can let you know in a couple of weeks. That's all people say, let you know in a couple of weeks. Well, I said, that's fine. Well, in a week, he called me and said, I can come. So we made arrangements for his trip to Europe and so on. And he helped us work with the refugees. And during the time that he was working with the refugees, he was near Tübingen. So he was taking some classes also at Tübingen University. But they weren't classes in to become an attorney. He was taking theological classes. And when he came back, he didn't go back to Harvard. He went to Philadelphia Seminary. And he decided to be a pastor. But he was so intelligent as a young man. And we were so grateful for that. And so no matter which occupation he would have chosen, he would have been a leader. And so he became, really, in my judgment, one of the better theologians in the Lutheran Church all over the United States, and including Europe. Well, I didn't think too much about this, but one time I invited him to speak to a group of people in Philadelphia. And the group was made up of social service workers and so on. And he agreed to come and speak to them. When he got up to speak, I introduced him. When he got up to speak, he said, "Now, I have a presentation for all of you. I'm going to share something that I haven't shared with too many people." And I thought, what's coming now? And then he proceeded to say, "The person who just introduced me is responsible for my being in the ministry." Well, I took that as a great honor. And thought, here we have this new theologian and so on. Well, he went on, he became really the leading theologian related to the World Council of Churches. Now, not everybody will say that, but I will, and many others will say it. And so he was one of the great theologians. And we had other theologians at the time. People who Tappert from Philadelphia, Dr. Tappert from Philadelphia, who was a fine theologian. And he and another person did much of the translating of the early writings of, I'm trying to think of his name now. And I can't. The early writings of, the third person that I would mention, in addition to Bill Lazarus and Joe Sittler, would be Anders Nygren. He was from Sweden, but he had written books on love, which were very much a part of the theology of the New Testament. And he turned out to be one of the finer theologians during that period. And he also turned out to be one of the most popular theologians because of what he wrote and the way he wrote. He talked about the love of people in congregations, one for another, one with another. He talked about love in family and so on. And he kept on. So that these were some of the theologians, I think, who were some of the finest theologians. Not the greatest theologians in terms of, in some cases, in terms of all of the theologians in the world. Of course, you have the two Niebuhrs, which Lutherans at that time, and especially when I was in seminary, they were the theologians. The two Niebuhrs, Richard and Reinhold. Reinhold, the theologian, and Richard Niebuhr, who is the New Testament theologian. So all of those were some of the great leaders I met, and some of the persons whom I had an opportunity to have conversations with, and which helped me in my life greatly.
You mentioned the New Testament, and we had for a period of years Amy Ruman. This was sort of her home congregation when she was representing the Lutheran Advocacy Ministry of Pennsylvania. And you once said that her dad was one of the preeminent New Testament scholars.
He was the preeminent, that's in my book, Testament scholar, and in the books of many. He was, if you had a question that in any way related to the New Testament, or New Testament background, or New Testament theology, and so on, he would be the person to ask. And I had an opportunity to have many conversations with him, especially during that period when I was called to be the director of the division that dealt with statements and that dealt with home mission development and all of those things. It was a large division. And so we frequently went to people like Ruman, Dr. Ruman, to ask him to come and help us. And he would come and he would speak to groups of young people who were about to enter the development of a new congregation, teach them the meaning of stewardship. Not only go out and raise money, but the meaning of stewardship. And he put it always in such a way that these young men, usually young men, would be able to go to their congregations and teach in ways that were meaningful. So Dr. Ruman was a strong person in my book. Yeah.
Over the course of your career, you obviously would have had a lot of interaction with leaders of other faiths.
Mm-hmm.
And so on your list of the great people who you interacted with, who would be someone outside the Lutheran faith?
Well, one of the persons I'd have to mention first is Dr. Visser Tuft. It's a strange name, and it's a T, capital H-O-O-F-T. It's a Dutch name. He was a Dutch person. But he became the leader of the Provisional Committee for the World Council of Churches. And I had had opportunity to meet him in a student setting before that, and had had opportunity to have a number of occasions. Well, on one occasion, in my work in that large division, I was asked to represent the church at some conference in Geneva. The first person I met when I walked into the conference was Visser Tuft. How wonderful it was to be able to greet him by name and to know that he was going to lead this session and that he had just become, really, the leader of the World Council of Churches. And he was reformed in his denomination. But what a leader for the World Council. An early leader, a first leader. And another person that he brings to mind is Robert Mackey. Robert Mackey was with an international organization that had as its goal to feed people, hungry people. I'd met him in the student world also, and got to see him and know him better overseas when I was working there. And then again, when I was in this other division, I would see him at conferences occasionally. One of the good things that I felt when I got to be the person who led the Division for Mission in North America for the Lutheran Church, and it had many outlets. But one of the things that I felt so good about is knowing so many people that I had met earlier in international settings. And it turned out to always be a wonderful experience.
So you've had the chance to interact and to see some of these great individuals. Tell us some of the stories about the debates that have taken place. It could be matters of doctrine. It could be matters of the church coming together in efforts.
Well, of course, I'm going to mention some, not necessarily in importance, but there were debates in the formation of the World Council of Churches. Very strong debates. The World Council of Churches, as European leaders had gotten together, they felt it needed to be formed not by individual churches, but by all of the churches in the nation come together, and then all those come together in the World Council of Churches. It was the Lutheran Church, and really the Lutheran Church in America, who disagreed with that and said, no, we must all come together as churches. This is not a world council of national bodies, but this is a formation of a world council of churches. So we must find a way to accept in the membership of the World Council of Churches the largest church and the smallest church, as long as it was a church. And meeting him and knowing him and at times arguing with him about that possibility, etc. It was a tremendous time. He was a strong leader and accepted the American principle. And still today, the World Council of Churches is made up of churches. The smallest church in the United States can be a member, but it's a member of the World Council, not first a member of the United States and then the whole of the country get together. Because that was done because people in the Lutheran Church felt that if that weren't stipulated and if it weren't organized in that way, we would have large churches, large national bodies dominating the World Council. For example, they described a picture. What would it mean to have the United States Church and the European Church meet with the African Church? Well, but with all churches having equal membership, it gave a certain stability to the whole process. It's always interesting.
It occurs to me that America is relatively recent to the Lutheran game in the standpoint of Lutheran faith and Lutheran churches were established in European countries for centuries before folks came over to America. And so there might be a lot of issues where they have a different point of view, or where the European churches view America as well, they're young, they have these new ideas, maybe there's some difficulty in incorporating all this.
Believe me, the Lutheran churches in Europe did feel that way about the church as it was growing up in North America. And the North American church had to really establish itself by the people who came to this country. They established themselves first and became churches in this country, pretty much by ethnic origin. For example, the Norwegians all got together and they formed what later became the American Lutheran Church. They formed what was first the Norwegian Lutheran Church with one seminary. And there, all their pastors were to be trained. The Swedish Lutheran Church, which was very ecumenical in nature, but it was Swedish, and they let people know that Augustana Church is Swedish Lutheran Church. And that went on Danish Evangelical Lutheran Church, the Suomi Synod, which was the Finnish Lutheran Church in this country. And all of those churches eventually came together. And today we are one church, the American Lutheran Church. And it took a lot for that to happen. The Lutheran churches had strong ethnic ties, and they kept their languages in their churches for a long time. I don't know if it's still possible to find a congregation that has Norwegian services every Sunday in this country. I'm not sure if that's, but not too many years ago, it was possible. Or then they went to the next step. They had both an English Lutheran service and a Norwegian Lutheran service. But many of them weren't large enough to handle that kind of split in the congregation. But nevertheless, we have been aware in this country of our Lutheran Church heritage, many from Europe. For example, I discovered that many people from my little home church down in York County, Pennsylvania, many of the people from that church came from a couple of towns near Leipzig in Germany. And so they spoke German for a period of time, and they were German Lutheran churches. But they were the first body, that group of churches that became the United Lutheran Church in 1918. And that then became the largest Lutheran church body and sort of dominated the field as far as Lutheran churches were concerned. But some of the ethnic churches remained ethnic churches, especially a few Danish and a few churches and some Swedish churches. But it wasn't until really this latest merger that before the American Lutheran Church was formed, that most of the churches came together in this country.
I know from being on the trip to Israel, that Richard's dad led, the one Sunday we went to worship at a Lutheran church, and it was a Lutheran church in the old city of Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And the service was entirely in German.
Yep.
And so you could obviously recognize the way the service was put together. When the minister was giving his sermon, he once made reference to Burma, so I recognized at least one word in his sermon. But it's a different thing to see the service that you're so familiar with conducted in a foreign language.
In a foreign language. Well, that's one of the interesting things that I had in Europe many times. Both when I was first there as a kid and in service to refugees, but also later I would be asked by the bishop to attend conferences in the name of our church in Europe. And there it was an interesting thing to see how the churches in my early period, that was in the early 1980s or the 1970s, really. It seemed strange. But by 1988, when I semi-retired, you could tell that our church was together. It was really one church. And they had taken the time, they made the effort to bring the churches together.
Well, several weeks ago, you led our adult Sunday school and had a fascinating discussion about your involvement and the importance of these social statements that come from the Lutheran Church. That certainly, we talk about how the organization of the church has changed. We talk about how the worship service has changed, become more modernized. Religious faith is stepping forward more, it seems, into the arena to make sure that as we make these decisions as a society, that the principles of faith are part of that debate.
That's right. That's right. And I was very much in favor of our creating social statements. And as a result, became very much involved in helping to do that. And I assisted in the development of several social statements before I had this position as the DM&A director. And the development of social statements came along rather slowly. But after it became the responsibility of the Division for Mission in North America to help put them together, more things happened. And I felt that the church couldn't be making all kinds of different statements to the people of government if they had anything at all to say. They couldn't be making all kinds of different statements and expected to get anywhere. At first, we had to, in a sense, get our house in order and understand how we felt as a church body about a particular issue, about peace, for example, or about many other things. Well, that sometimes worked, sometimes we had more difficulty. But one of the ideal ways to go about this, and it happened in a few statements, was to have people from all over the country, all over the church, discussing the meaning of certain issues and how they felt about the church's relationship to the state on this particular issue or on that particular issue. And we got the church to come together on a number of statements. For example, the race statement that was developed and became the official policy of the Lutheran Church. And that statement was put together in a way that it should be. Many people participated across the church. And then we had synod committees, groups. This is one time a committee was worth establishing. They were put together committees to discuss the issue within that area. And eventually, when all the synods came together, and a special committee put all of those thoughts together, it became a statement of the church. Not everybody agreed with everything, but most people agreed with most things in the statements. And I think we could say that. And we could then say, as we went before a group in Congress or a group in one of the states, this is the position of the Lutheran Church, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. And so I participated in that development, and I consider it one of the finest things done.
Were you involved in the development of Lutheran Advocacy Ministry of PA so that these social statements weren't just coming from some Lutheran Mount Olympus, that there were actually people in the trenches as government was making policies and writing laws and developing regulations?
I was very much involved in Pennsylvania. I wasn't the director of anything in Pennsylvania, but I had this other position, which meant that I could frequently and at will speak with the synod presidents and this guy. And before we established the synod office on advocacy in Pennsylvania, and you know all about that, but before we did that, I had opportunity to talk to the 4 synod presidents and ask them to support it. And if they couldn't support, what couldn't they support? And we finally got to the point where they all agreed. And not only that, it might well be a good thing to have a person in Harrisburg who would bring the message back to the synods and vice versa, and the synods would talk to that person. And yes, I did have something to do with that, and have considered that one of the better things done. And you know that so well.
Have there been times over the course of your career where you could see the church was threatening to go in different paths, or at and the opposite of that is when everyone is moving too quickly, sort of the herd mentality, and you had to say, "Whoa, let's wait a minute here."
That's right.
And reflect further.
That's right. Well, there have been times when the churches, sometimes there was division among synods. And not all synods wanted to act together on a given issue. For example, We can always count, as the present politicians can, I suppose, on a more liberal California and a more liberal East Coast. That's just the way life is in this country. And we had sometimes difficulty getting the church to act on a given issue and to act unanimously. For example, one of the issues was also a key issue for me, and I could have easily lost my position. We were debating in our church whether or not we could use one of the statements, the statement on race, for example, to assist in South Africa. And while they were going through their difficult time. And one of the things that occurred was I almost lost my position at the time. And I say that in all humility, but I did. I was insisting that the finances in the Board of Pensions, and there were many there, that they could be used to advocate certain issues for South Africa by advocating with the banks and so on. Dr. James Crumley, the bishop of the church, was of the exact opposite mind. He didn't think that we had any business using our funds to do something in South Africa. And I said we not only had a responsibility, we needed to do it. We were called to do it. Well, he didn't agree, and he said, let's take it to the executive board. Or I think I suggested that. The executive board of the church at that time agreed with me that we should be able to have the pension board do it. But they'd like the convention to talk about it and decide. Now, they could do that. They could move that on to the convention. Well, we went to the convention, and I didn't know. I told Joe when I left for the convention, I don't know if I'll have a job when I come back, but we're going to go. We kept pressing that position in the convention. And lo and behold, the convention agreed with us. And Dr. Crowley reluctantly said, this is the way then we can go. So that was one of the debates which I don't care to have too many of those, really. But it was a helpful debate because it was because of people in our church taking different positions that helped the church as a body think through that issue. It isn't too often that they oppose their principal bishop to do something. And I thought that we had made a tremendous stride in combating racism when we had accomplished that. And James Crowley and I remained friends, and he had a difficult thing to take inside, but nevertheless, that's the way it worked.
Well, that story presents an interesting parallel, really, to the New Testament, because it's whether the church takes care of itself or whether it's Jesus instructed that we had an obligation to go out into the world and apply the principles of faith. And so it's very interesting. And then also the discussion within the church paralleled the discussion which was taking place in government at the same time.
Yeah.
So for people who say that there should be a wall of separation between religion and politics, there are politics within religions.
That's right. That's right. And sometimes those politics are felt, in strong ways. Like this one, for example, because Jim Crumley, and I don't think he'd mind my saying this, was from the South, had grown up in that milieu, and insisting on certain things like we were insisting upon, he felt had a way of disturbing the local people in ways that we didn't have a right to disturb them. So I understood his position, but I still disagreed with it. And but that's your analysis is correct.
That raises another interesting point. At the time when the civil rights movement was sweeping this country, where was the Lutheran Church? Were we doing pronouncements from on high, or were Lutherans marching in Selma and other places?
I don't know if individual Lutherans marched in Selma. They may have, because I couldn't go, or I would have gone. I had another obligation at the time that I simply couldn't change. But we, as a Lutheran church body, are very quiet at certain times, especially in certain parts of the church. And those parts weren't always major geographical parts. Sometimes they were within individual congregations, of course, where people. There are people who will accept the statement as adopted by the church. And there are other people who want to have nothing to do with it, but most of the time remain quietly by and don't say too much. But in this instance, we had many people that spoke their mind about the issue of wanting to help South Africa, because we felt that we were helping a group that had a lot to lose if they lost. If they lost the argument in South Africa, they would lose so much as far as their opportunity and so on to be the Christian church in South Africa.
Churches are like a lot of other institutions in that they tend to be conservative, and that's not conservative versus liberal. It is conservative in not taking fast action or not diving into controversy without a lot of consideration and a lot of counsel. But have there been times where the Lutheran Church has been too quick to act?
Well, there are times when the church is too quick to act, I think. We had a major concern at the time that the Vietnam War issue was before us. we had to avoid this becoming an issue of it's my church or my state. We had to avoid it becoming that. And we had to stay with the issue. But we had some who wanted to rush in and say, we can't wait. There are too many people. Our young men are going to war when they didn't need to. And of course, some of those young men wanted to go, and some didn't. So how could the church function best in a situation like that? And so what we tried to do, and I know that we were criticized severely by some people who wanted us to move ahead quickly and make statements from the rooftops that we were opposed to this Vietnam War and let's get out of it quickly. And we had a difficult time restraining without condemning. And if you ever want an interesting trial at something, try that. When you want a whole church to be concerned about the Vietnam War and to work toward ending it using established methods of ending it. And we're being encouraged, and some people did rush forward, of wanting to end it by demonstration and by indicating that this wasn't going to go, and condemn the national body in every way possible. And so we tried to keep that on a stable basis and work. And we did. But maybe we would have gotten something done much more quickly had we gone another way. Or we certainly wouldn't have done anything if we hadn't done anything.
Yeah, we can't say that the battle for civil rights has been concluded because it still goes on.
That's right.
We still, in some of our policies, we still refight the Vietnam War.
That's right.
In some respects. But one of the issues now that seems to be on the mind of a lot of people, and it's something that, again, has a 60, 70-year history, and it continues to go, is the question of Israel and the Palestinians. Is that something that pulls hard at the church?
It's something that does pull hard at the church. And we are frequently, because the Jewish people and the Jewish nation, I should say, with their good organization, which is good in comparison to the Palestinian efforts, we feel that many times, as a church body, we have to speak up for the Palestinians. Sometimes it appears as though we are condemning Jews and siding with Palestinians, when, however, it's a way of wanting both to establish appropriate borders and appropriate places for themselves, and then to stick with that. But it no more gets to a point of stability, and the next day there's a bombing, or the next day there's another problem, initiated by one or the other. And we have a tendency, I think, in this country, to side more with the Jewish state and with the Palestinians. So when the church sometimes speaks for and with the Palestinians, it appears more than it should as being opposed to the Jewish. And we're going through that right now. Right now. And I hope it doesn't set us up for another explosion.